looking at some of the blood vessels that we encounter. So we start out with the heart. And remember, we're leaving the left ventricle here in order to enter our biggest arteries, which happens to be the aorta. So we go into our arteries, and then blood travels from arteries into smaller arteries, which are called arterioles. From arterioles, we head into capillaries, which are really tiny vessels. They're really tiny, they're 1 cell layer thick, and this is really intentional. This is to allow for that diffusion of those products that I mentioned earlier. So oxygen can diffuse out into the tissues, waste products, mainly carbon dioxide, ammonia, and so on, which are breakdown products from proteins, can enter the capillaries again through that very thin cell layer. And then from the capillaries, we then reemerge into venules, which are slightly smaller veins, and then into veins, and then the largest veins, which go right back into the heart. So we've got arteries, large branching vessels that take blood away from the heart. We've got arterioles, which are smaller branching vessels. These have really high resistance, and it's an attempt to keep the blood flowing in one direction. The high pressures there, because we leave the heart has to have enough of that force to keep blood moving to go really far out to the peripheral tissues, such as the fingers and toes and blood vessels of the eyes. And so the resistance has to be high in order to keep that pressure, to keep the flow unidirectional. Otherwise, we would see stagnation in those large vessels. Then we get into the capillaries, so the smallest vessels. This is the site of exchange between blood and tissues. Then into the venules. The venules will then converge into veins, and then the veins, as I mentioned, will go right back into the heart. And so this is a closed system. And what we mean by closed system is that unless we puncture or injure a vessel or one of the arteries or veins, the blood does not leave this system. It's only going to keep going in this cyclical fashion around and around, and it's never actually leaving the system. We can compare this to an open system like the GI system, right? I can introduce food or molecules into my mouth, and then they can obviously exit through the other end of the GI system. And so that's an example of an open system, but the blood vessels and the vasculature in general is an example of a closed system, because unless I introduce something either intravenously or into an artery, there's no way to enter this system or to exit this system without doing that. Let's talk a little bit about the blood here. So the blood is composed of erythrocytes, which are red blood cells. These are mainly important for transporting oxygen. So they actually have those oxygen molecules or carbon dioxide bound to them. Then there are leukocytes. These are usually referred to as white blood cells. These are important in the immune system. They help to defend the body against pathogens. These are going to include our T cells, B cells, macrophages, neutrophils. Then we've got platelets. So platelets are non-cellular fragments. They're not actually cells of themselves. They don't have a nucleus, but they're really important for blood clotting. And so platelets are also always circulating, so that whenever we have an injury to a blood vessel, it's already in the blood. And so it doesn't have to be made or be synthesized or secreted. It's already circulating in the blood, and it can just aggregate at that site of injury and help to seal up that injury and create a wound or a platelet plug formation, which we'll talk about next semester. And then the last component here is the plasma. Plasma is the fluid and the solutes. So if we take the blood, take away all the cells and the platelets, what we have left is the liquidy or the fluid compartment, the fluid component of the blood, which is called the plasma. Now, if we took a vial of blood and we centrifuged it, so we spun it really quickly, which separated the components by density, we would see that all that floats up to the top is called the plasma. This is about 55% of the entire total blood volume. And then what settles to the bottom is the cells, the red blood cells, erythrocytes, the white blood cells, leukocytes, and then the platelets. Now, the erythrocytes are going to be the majority of the cellular component of the blood. So about 45% of the entire blood volume, whereas leukocytes and platelets are a really small percentage of what we see in terms of the cellular and the non-cellular components of the blood. So we've got 55% plasma, just fluid and solutes like sodium, potassium, chloride, calcium. A 45% is going to be the erythrocytes or the red blood cells, and then a very small percentage would be our leukocytes and platelets. Okay. Let's talk about the two circuits that are involved in the cardiovascular system. We kind of alluded to them earlier. We began talking about the pulmonary circulation and then the systemic circulation. And so the pulmonary circuit is really supplied by the right side of the heart. This is where we have that deoxygenated blood leaving the right ventricle, making its way through the pulmonary artery and into both lungs. It's basically the blood vessels from the heart to the lungs and then from the lungs back to the heart. So it's going to include the pulmonary arteries as well as the pulmonary veins that I pointed out earlier. This can be compared to the systemic circulation. This is basically what's supplied by the left side of the heart. So the blood that leaves the left ventricle makes its way into the into the aorta. And then from the aorta, it makes its way out into the arteries, the arterioles, the capillaries, the venules, the veins, and then back into the heart. And so all of the vessels that we look at, all of those vessels, the arteries, arterioles, capillaries, and then the larger venules and veins that make their way back to the heart, all of that is forming the systemic circulation. Now, there are two types of flow through the cardiovascular system. We've got series flow, which happens through the general system, the general circulation of the cardiovascular system. And then when we look at the systemic and pulmonary circuits individually, this is an example of parallel flow. And I'll talk about what that means here with this drawing. So just to kind of recap what we've been saying here, we talked about the heart sending out oxygenated blood through our arteries and arterioles out to the body tissues. From the body, we have that diffusion taking place. And then we have deoxygenated blood making its way back to the heart via venules and veins. And so this is the systemic circulation here, right? Everything that leaves the heart from the left side and returns to the heart from the right side. All of this is considered the systemic circulation. And then from the heart, we take that deoxygenated blood out through our pulmonary arteries into the lungs where it can be reoxygenated and then back into the left side of the heart. And so all of this is considered the pulmonary circulation. So here's the systemic circulation, here's the pulmonary circulation. Now, when we talk about series and parallel flow, the entire system is called a series flow. And it's a series flow because the blood has to go to each one of these locations. It has to go to the heart. It has to go out to the body, to the peripheral tissues. It has to go back to the heart, and then it has to go to the lungs. So blood does not have an option when it comes to these four steps. It must go from the heart to the body, to the heart, back to the lungs. And this entire general circulation is an example of series flow. Parallel flow, on the other hand, is this idea that blood has an option. It can take a route. So within the pulmonary circuit itself, we can see that blood can either go to the left lung or to the right lung. And so we can think about this as being an option for that blood to take. And so that's an example of a parallel flow. All of the blood does not go to the left lung, and then all of the blood goes to the right lung. Blood has an option to take here. It can go to the left lung or to the right lung because of that branching of the pulmonary artery. Likewise, when we look at the systemic circulation, the blood here also has an option. We do not see all of our blood going to our liver, all of our blood going to our kidneys, all of our blood going to our bladder, all of the blood going to our extremities, to our limbs. Instead, we see that blood has an option here. It's going to split up, and it can go to the liver, some of it can go to the kidneys, some of it can go to the bladder, some of it can go to the extremities. And so this branching that we see in the systemic circulation and the parallel circulation, and the pulmonary circulation are examples of parallel flow, whereas the entire thing, the general cardiovascular circulation, is an example of series flow. All right, let's see what questions we have here. So the question I'm seeing here, do the left and right side both take in deoxygenated blood and then pump out oxygenated blood to the organs? So no, that's another good point to make. So the left side of the heart, I'm assuming you're talking about the heart here. The left side of the heart does not ever get deoxygenated blood. The right side of the heart does not ever get oxygenated blood. Oxygenated blood is only in the left side of the heart. It comes back fresh from the lungs through the pulmonary veins. It enters the left atrium. It goes down into the left ventricle, and then it goes out to the systemic circulation. The deoxygenated blood at this point comes back to the right side of the heart, goes into the right atrium, down into the right ventricle, and then it's pumped out into the pulmonary vessels where it can enter the lungs and be reoxygenated. And so we don't see both oxygenated and deoxygenated blood on both sides of the heart. Instead, we only see oxygenated on the left side and we only see deoxygenated on the right side. Okay, perfect. All right, any other questions about this series and parallel flow? It's usually a bit of a confusion for some students. So let me know what questions you have about series versus parallel. Okay. So just to kind of explain these ideas here just further a little bit, we've got the cardiovascular system. We said it's a closed system, and because there's no point of entering or exiting unless we puncture a vessel or injure a vessel, this is considered a series flow. The blood has to move to all 4 points that I pointed out. So the heart, the left side, right, to the body, the peripheral tissues, back to the heart, the right side, and then back up to the lung. So blood has to take all 4 of those stops, all of the blood, and then come back to its starting point. The parallel flow, on the other hand, this is where independent organs have their independent circulation. And so as blood leaves the left side of the heart, some of it goes to the brain, some of it goes back to the heart, the coronary arteries that supply the heart muscle itself. Some of it goes to the GI tract, some to the kidneys, some to the skeletal muscles, the skin, etc. And so here we don't see all of the blood going to any one of these spots. Instead, we see this branching, and the blood kind of takes an option and hits either one of these peripheral locations. Okay. Let's talk about the coronary circulation. So as we pointed out on this slide, one of the options, one of the stops, one of the branches that blood can take as a part of this parallel flow is to go to the heart itself. Now, it's kind of tempting to think that, right, the heart is a pump, it's receiving all of the blood. It can basically take its oxygen from the blood that's in the chamber. And that's not true, okay? What happens is blood leaves the aorta through a very small branch, 2 small branches rather, that circulate through the heart itself and supply the heart muscle with blood. This circulation is called the coronary circulation, and it's one of those branches of parallel flow. So the heart is kind of selfish in this way. It's going to take the very first blood from the very first vessel. So here we have the aorta, which leaves the left ventricle. And branching from the aorta, we have the right coronary artery supplying the right side of the heart and the left coronary artery supplying the left side of the heart. And these vessels run on the outside of the heart muscle itself and actually feed the heart muscle with oxygen and nutrients. So the heart essentially has its own set of capillaries, and it takes the very first blood coming out from the very first vessel. And we'll talk more about the branches of these coronary arteries when we look at the anatomy of the heart. That's going to also be in AMP2, but you'll see how the left and right coronary arteries branch out into other arteries, such as the left anterior descending, and supply different parts of the heart, so the ventricles, the atria, the interventricular septum, and so on.